Hi, and welcome back for part 8 in Romans chapter 8. I'm just going to read the verse we did last time and then today's verse. And I'm reading the two together because they are intimately connected. And one of the biggest dangers of Bible study is that you take one verse and you look at it in isolation from the thread and the flow of the argument that it falls in. And we need to read today's verse in follow-on from the verse we looked at last time. So let's pick up from verse 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. And that word purpose at the end of verse 28 is the clue to what 29 is about, because 29 is about God's purpose. What is that purpose? And you can see the links in the chain of Paul's thought. So those who've been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son, that he might be firstborn among many brothers. And those he predestined, he also called. And those he called, he also justified. And those he justified, he also glorified. What is this verse talking about? Well, it's talking about God's purpose, that we have been called in accordance with God's purpose. Verse 28 says, and verse 29 expresses what that purpose is. That purpose of God, that he decided from the very beginning, is to make us like Jesus, to let us share in his glory, to conform us to the image of Jesus. Now, there's one of those words in this verse that Christians have killed each other over, probably, just about, certainly in times gone by, and still argue about today. And that word is the word predestination. So we need to think about it. There are two ways. In broad terms, there's lots and lots of detail, and there's a lot of ink been spilt over this verse. But in broad terms, I think there are two ways you can read this verse. Many Christians will read it personally and individually, and they will read it to say that God has, before time, predestined those who are his, you and me, if you're a Christian, to become Christians, and that you were chosen before the beginning of time, predestined, foreknown and predestined by God. And I think probably most Christians will read the verse that way. And I have to say, in gentle terms, because I don't want to argue with anybody about this, but I don't think that's what the verse is saying at all, because I don't think we've read it properly if we read it that way. And I think the most important thing to notice in this verse is that this is about what is it that God has predestined. I read this verse in the corporate sense, and that it is what God has predestined is the destination, not the individuals on the journey. It seems to me that what this verse is saying is that what God decided before the beginning of time is that those individuals who would comprise his church would arrive at glory. It's the destination that's been predestined. Read the verse. It says he has predestined us. There's no punctuation there. There's no pause, I don't think. It says we've been predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son. That's our destiny. That's the destiny of the church. That God decided from the beginning of time that his church would arrive in glory. What God decided before the beginning of time, what God decided from the beginning, was what the destination would be. Not which individuals would arrive there or would join the journey. Now, that's my way of reading it. So I read it in a corporate sense, that it's God's church in a corporate sense that is elect. It's God's church corporately that is foreknown, and that it is God's church corporately that is predestined to glory, not the individual. And that's a debate that will rage on, I'm quite sure, but that's my take on it. That God has decided that all who believe would one day be conformed to the likeness of Jesus. I'm not playing the verse down, it's no less wonderful to take it that way, that God decided from the beginning to make his church end up in glory through that process of being called, of being justified, and one day of being glorified with Christ. That is our destination, and there is nothing that can deflect or separate us from that destination, because God has foreordained the destination. God has decided that's where we're going to get to. It's like when Jesus said to his disciples, let's go to the other side of the lake. He was determined as to where they were going. And they get halfway across the lake and this storm hits. And the disciples begin to think, we're not going to get there, we're not going to get there. We're going to sink, we're going to drown. Master, Master, don't you care? But Jesus had said to them, let's go to the other side of the lake. And you know what? They got to the other side of the lake. And in the same way, God has said from the beginning of time that his church will be conformed to the likeness of his Son, that his people will share his glory. And whatever suffering we may experience on this journey, God's purpose, God's eternal purpose, cannot be deflected. God's eternal purpose cannot be blocked, stopped, snuffed out. Whatever storms may come, whatever may happen, we are destined for glory. That is where God has determined to take his church. Who comprises that church? Well, I think that's a matter of free will. And there are other verses that would support that view. What's predestined is the destination. Clues in the word. What's predestined is that God's church will arrive in glory. That is the purpose to which we have been called. That is the place to which we are heading. And nothing can thwart God's purpose. So in all things, in the groaning, God works for the good of those who love him, for those who've been called according to his purpose. God takes all things and uses them. If we will play the game and respond, he uses them to shape our character, because his purpose, his goal, is glory. His goal is to make us more like Jesus. And there isn't anything that happens to us that God is not able to take up as a tool in that process. That process won't be finished until eternity. But God's goal in this life is to move us towards that glory. I'll finish with a little story. I remember my pastor once saying to me, he said, what I hope is that when I die and I arrive in heaven, that the angels will say to me, hey, Ted, that was his name, you haven't changed much. By which he meant that having arrived in glory in heaven, they would mean you haven't changed much from that moment you'd left earth. In other words, that his hope was that a good part of the becoming like Jesus would have actually taken place on earth. That yes, of course, the final touches, the finishing glory can only happen in heaven. But his hope was that he would have made some significant progress to it on earth. So that when he got to heaven, he didn't need a complete makeover. And sometimes as Christians, we can fall into the trap of thinking, well, we'll just wait for the makeover in heaven. I won't bother changing and growing now. I'll just wait to be made like Jesus when I get to heaven. That's not how my pastor thought. His view was, let's become as much like Christ as I can in this world today, so that when I'm finally clothed in glory, the angels might say, you've not had to change much.